Commemorations are held to mark the fall of the Berlin Wall on this day in 1989. The wall, which stood for 28 years, divided the communist East from the West. The Indian Prime Minister hails a verdict by the country's top court that the site of a 16th century mosque destroyed in the 1990s should be used to house a Hindu temple. And supporters of Brazil's former president Lula da Silva rejoice as he walks out of prison. But conservatives in the country are much less pleased by that news. Welcome back to the France 24 newsroom in Paris. I'm Tom Burgess-Orson. Thank you very much for joining us. First, commemorations have been taking place today in Berlin because it was on this day, the 9th of November 1989, that euphoric Germans began clambering on top of the Berlin Wall, which divided the communist East and the capitalist West. But a quick succession of events meant that East German border guards suddenly found themselves completely overwhelmed by large crowds, and they were forced to open up the gates to West Berlin, allowing free passage for the first time since the wall was built in 1961. Well, the German Chancellor has been leading today's commemoration. She spoke earlier in the Chapel of Reconciliation close to the wall. Here's what she said.
Our values of freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and the defense of civil rights cannot be taken for granted. They must be embodied, upheld, and defended. And in the future, Europe must fight for democracy, freedom, tolerance, and human rights.
The German Chancellor Angela Merkel speaking there. Well, earlier I caught up with France 24's Nick Spicer in Berlin, who was following that ceremony, and he told us more about the key messages they wanted to get across.
Germans have a different perspective on what happened, whether, according to whether they come from East or West, it did well or poorly from reunification, and even North and South or other divisions in Germany. But look, I think, first of all, a feeling of immense gratitude and an awareness that this could have gone violently. 1989 saw Tiananmen Square afterwards in China. That ended horribly. You can't even talk about it on the internet in China. People here, are aware that it was a very costly reunification, that there were more differences, I think, than people expected. Sure, everybody had family on the other side of the border. Sure, they all spoke German. But culturally, the mindsets were radically different. I think there are parts of East Germany that did very well. They're economically blossoming. I think of Jena, Leipzig, for instance, those cities. Other parts of Germany, for instance, the coal-producing regions that have not done so well. Let's remember, East Germany lost about 20% of its population, big migration westwards. And that curve is just now changing direction. People are coming back home, and this is a process that's going to take a very long time. The big, I think, concern for Germans is the rise of the far-right alternative for Germany, which is connected to the East-West divide. The reason why? It's because they do best in the former Eastern regions, where there is frustration over the way reunification took place and over the way the rebuilding of East Germany took place, and the alternative for Germany is winning power by designating a scapegoat, namely migrants, a playbook from the 1930s. And that is a concern for many Germans here. Cause for celebration, but a concern as well that some of the values of 1989 may be being forgotten.
France 24's Nick Spicer reporting from Berlin. Well, the scene of the wall coming down 30 years ago was broadcast right across the globe. It was an event that was followed by the collapse of the communist regime and German reunification less than a year later. Well, let's take a look back at that historic day.
Standing on the wall at the Brandenburg Gate, thousands of East Germans have just crossed the border into West Berlin. This wall, a symbol of the Cold War that had imprisoned them for 28 years, 2 months and 27 days, had finally fallen.
I can't believe it. It's marvelous. It's fantastic.
For 3 years I've asked to go to West Berlin, and now here I am.
For months, East Germans had protested for democracy. On the 4th of November in East Berlin, 1 million people took to the streets. Then came the fateful day. At an afternoon press conference on the 9th, Socialist Party spokesman Günter Schabowski accidentally announced the border would be opened immediately. A few hours later, thousands of Berliners dashed to the crossing points that line the wall. Confronted with the huge crowd, Lieutenant Harold Jäger is overwhelmed. He asks for instructions from his superiors, who fail to respond. So he opens the border. Years later, he reminisces.
Ich hatte die schönste und die schrecklichste Nacht.
It was the most beautiful and the most terrible night of my life. Terrible because I realized that the party had abandoned me. My vision of the world shattered that night.
Meine Weltanschauung damals völlig zusammengebrochen ist.
A collapse that sparked mass euphoria. Those from the east were welcomed with open arms by those from the west, and the wall of shame became one of unity. It was chaos, but not one drop of blood was shed. At first reluctant, authorities too joined the protesters. And Chancellor Kohl cut short his trip to Poland to return home.
It was one of the greatest days of my life. It had always been my goal to pursue a unified Germany.
His goal was rapidly accomplished. 11 months later, Germany was reunified and Berlin became a symbol of freedom.
Now turning our eye to some other world news, India's Supreme Court has today ruled on what has become one of the country's most contentious issues, a dispute between Hindus and Muslims over a site deemed to be sacred by both religions. Well, the country's top court ruled in favour of a Hindu temple being built on the disputed plot in the northern town of Ayodhya. Well, a 16th century mosque once stood on that site until it was destroyed by Hindu hardliners in 1992, something that sparked interreligious violence claiming the lives of more than 2,000 people. France 24's Monty Francis has more.
It is considered India's most disputed religious site. A 5-judge panel ended that dispute Saturday, ruling that the holy site of Ayodhya belongs to Hindus who want to build a temple there to honor their revered deity, Lord Ram. Muslims, who also laid claim to the land, wanted to rebuild a mosque that was destroyed at the site by Hindu hardliners in 1992. 2,000 people died in the violence that followed. The court said that a plot of land nearby would be given to Muslims so they could build a mosque. There are new fears of sectarian violence in the wake of Saturday's ruling. Stores and schools are closed as a precaution, internet services have been cut, and more than 5,000 police and paramilitary force members have been deployed to the town in northern India where the site is located. The BJP, the party of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, campaigned for the building of a Hindu temple at the site. After the verdict, Modi said on Twitter, "The halls of justice have amicably concluded a matter going on for decades. Every side, every point of view is given adequate time and opportunity to express differing points of view. This verdict will further increase people's faith in judicial processes." But many Muslims don't see it that way. As a religious minority in India, they see the ruling as a reflection of their status as second-class citizens.
Well, there's been mixed reaction in Brazil to the news that the country's former president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, walked out of prison on Friday. His release came less than 24 hours after the country's Supreme Court ruled that a person can only be jailed once the entire appeals process has been exhausted. Well, hundreds of Lula's cheering supporters were waiting outside the prison in the southern city of Curitiba as the 74-year-old former leader left that facility. But conservatives are less pleased with this news. Many believe that Lula's sentence for corruption and money laundering was justified, although he denies any wrongdoing. France 24's Brian Quinn has more now on how news of Lula's release has gone down in Brazil.
On the streets of Salvador, Brazil, a massive party as supporters of Lula da Silva marched, danced, and sang to celebrate his release from prison. Hours earlier, in the city of Curitiba, where the leftist former president spent 18 months behind bars, those who came to meet him as he walked free expressed their feelings of vindication.
The release of Lula was very important for the Brazilian democracy. We felt like we were in prison together with him in that cell. and now our spirit is free again.
Thursday's decision by the country's Supreme Court has the potential to free thousands of convicts who have yet to exhaust their appeals. Critics say the ruling could allow those who are guilty but wealthy enough to afford top lawyers to avoid justice for years. In the capital, Rio de Janeiro, not everyone is pleased with Lula's liberation.
I'm not in favor of Lula's release because, in my opinion, it's not what the people want.
The sprawling anti-corruption investigation that resulted in Lula's conviction, known as Operation Car Wash, has brought down dozens of businessmen and politicians. But leaked messages published by news site The Intercept, appearing to show a key judge in car wash cases secretly collaborating with prosecutors, has given ammunition to Lula's supporters who say his conviction was engineered to keep him out of last year's presidential election. That judge is now serving as justice minister in the government of far-right President Jair Bolsonaro. Despite his release, Lula is still legally barred from returning to public office, but that too could change if the Supreme Court decides that his prosecution was politically biased.
Well, just as a footnote to that report, the president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, has reacted on Twitter to the news of the release of the former president Lula da Silva. He's demanding that Brazilians refrain from giving the man he called a rascal any ammunition by showing support for him. So that's a plea from the Brazilian president there, clearly displeased at the news of the release of the former president Lula da Silva. Well, that brings us up to date with the world news. Thank you for watching. Stay with us here on France 24.